Some nights break quietly, with rain softening the world and grief learning how to breathe again. A man carrying more than he can name pauses, and a woman holding everything she has left waits. What follows is not rescue, but shelter owned, slowly, shared carefully, until hope remembers its own weight. Stay with them. Listen. The rain had been falling long enough to feel settled, no longer sharp or hurried, just steady and patient. It softened the streetlights and pressed the city into a narrower shape. He walked with his collar turned up, hands deep in his pockets, shoes already past caring about staying dry. The day had been long in the way that left no single moment to point to, just hours that asked for attention and gave none back. He moved carefully, out of habit more than necessity. His thoughts stayed close to home, where a small bed would already be occupied, where breathing would be even and trusting. That knowledge shaped his pace. He never hurried at night. There was nothing ahead that needed rushing toward. The clinic sat dark at the corner, its windows reflecting the rain instead of light. As he passed, something in the stillness caught his eye. Not movement exactly, but the absence of it. Someone stood beneath the narrow awning, pressed close to the brick as if trying to take up less space than she was allowed. She was soaked through, hair clinging to her face, coat dark with rain. In her arms, a baby slept or pretended to, wrapped too thinly to be comfortable. He slowed without deciding to, stopped a few steps away. He did not speak at first. The rain filled the space between them, doing the work of sound. She noticed him only when he was already still. Her shoulders tightened, then settled again when he didn't move closer. Her grip on the baby adjusted, instinctive and practiced. The child made a small sound, more breath than cry, and she swayed once, barely visible. "Clinic's closed," he said quietly, as if she might not know. "Yes," she answered. Her voice was steady, though tired. She did not explain further. He nodded. The rain ran from the awning in uneven lines, splashing near her shoes. One sock was visibly soaked through. The baby's blanket was damp along one edge. "There's a cafe," he said after a moment, 2 blocks that way. Still open. She looked in the direction he indicated, then back down at the child. "Thank you," she said. "We're all right." He believed that she believed it. He also believed she was wrong. The baby shifted again. A soft protest this time. Small enough to be ignored, but not by someone who had learned the weight of those sounds. He remembered nights like that, standing still so as not to wake the world further, listening for changes in breathing that meant everything. "Rain's not letting up," he said. Not an argument, just a fact placed gently between them. She hesitated. Not long, just enough to show that accepting anything cost her something. "We were waiting," she said, "for it to pass." He glanced at the sky, though there was nothing there to read. Sometimes it doesn't. Her mouth curved briefly at that. Not quite a smile. He took off his jacket then, slow enough that she could stop him if she wanted to. When she didn't, he held it out. She stared at it, as if it were heavier than it was. "For the baby," he said. She looked down again, then back up. "I can't. It's just for now." She accepted it finally, draping it carefully so it covered the child first. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had done this under worse conditions. They stood together under the awning, not touching, not speaking. The rain softened further, as if encouraged by their quiet. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. She took a breath before answering. "Yes," she said. After a pause, "Not tonight." He didn't ask more. He thought of his own front door, the way it opened without resistance, the way warmth waited without being told. He thought of the extra chair at the table, the way small hands left crumbs everywhere no matter how careful he was. "There's room," he said, and surprised himself with how certain it sounded. "Just to dry off, get warm." She searched his face not for kindness but for risk. Whatever she saw there seemed to settle something. "Just for a bit," she said. They walked then, side by side. The distance between them stayed careful, respectful. The baby slept on, unaware of the shift being made on her behalf. The rain followed them, but it felt different now, less like something to endure, more like something they were passing through together. The hallway light was the first thing he turned on, not the living room. It cast a narrow, dependable glow across the entryway, enough to see shoes and coats and the worn edge of the rug. He stepped aside to let her enter first. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold carefully, as if the space might object to her presence. "Bathroom's there," he said, nodding down the short hall. "Towels are clean." She murmured thanks and moved toward it, the baby still tucked close beneath his jacket. He watched the way she held her, secure but not tight, aware of every shift in weight. When the bathroom door closed, he turned the lock on the front door, more out of routine than fear, and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood. The house felt smaller with someone new inside it, but not strained. Just aware, he went to the kitchen and filled the kettle, setting it on the stove. The cabinets held the usual mismatched mugs, cereal boxes pushed back, a stack of plastic containers waiting to be reused. Nothing impressive. Everything familiar. He moved quietly, listening for sounds from the hallway, for any sign that she needed something she wouldn't ask for. When the bathroom door opened again, steam followed her out. Her hair was damp but no longer dripping. She had wrapped the baby in one of his towels, folding it with practiced efficiency so it stayed in place without pins. The jacket lay folded over her arm. "I'll wash this," she said, holding it out. "Later," he replied. He took it anyway, set it over the back of a chair. "There's soup." "It's simple." "Simple's fine." He poured the soup into a bowl, added a piece of bread beside it. She sat at the table without being told where, placing the baby in her lap and shifting the towel to keep her warm. He set the bowl down gently, then a mug of tea within reach. "Thank you," she said again. This time it sounded different, less formal, more tired. He took the chair across from her, but didn't sit right away. The baby stirred, eyes fluttering open for a moment before settling again. He watched the small rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers curled and released. "She's very calm," he said. "She doesn't waste much energy," the woman replied. "Not unless she has to." He nodded. That made sense to him. The house creaked softly, the normal sounds of settling wood and distant pipes. From the bedroom down the hall came the faintest noise a breath caught, then released. His child turning in sleep. He listened without meaning to, then relaxed when the sound smoothed out again. "She won't wake," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not easily." She looked up. "You have a child?" "Yes." "How old?" "6." She absorbed that quietly, eyes returning to the baby. "She's still learning the difference between noise and danger," she said. "Everything sounds important." He smiled faintly. "That doesn't go away. It just changes shape." She took a spoonful of soup, careful not to drip. He finally sat down, resting his hands on the table. They ate in silence for a while. Not the awkward kind, just the kind that came from being too tired to decorate words. After a few minutes, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded cloth, using it to wipe the baby's cheek where milk had dried. She did it automatically, without interrupting her own breathing. "You don't have to stay long," he said. "Just until you're warm." She nodded. "I won't take more than I should." He didn't answer that. Instead, he stood and went to the hallway closet, returning with a small stack of folded clothes. "These were hers," he said. "Some might fit. No obligation." She touched the fabric lightly, then nodded. "Thank you." The baby woke fully then, a soft sound rising in her throat. The woman shifted her, adjusted the towel, and began to feed her without apology. The room seemed to accommodate the act naturally, as if it had always expected it. His child's door opened a crack. Small footsteps paused, uncertain. A face appeared, hair sticking up at odd angles, eyes squinting against the light. "Dad?" she whispered. "I'm here," he said. He did not move toward her, letting her decide. She stepped into the room, gaze fixing immediately on the baby. "Is she sick?" "No," he said, "just little." The woman looked up then, careful, respectful. "Hello," she said softly. His child nodded once, solemn. She approached the table slowly, peering at the baby with interest rather than fear. "She's very small," she observed. "Yes," the woman agreed. "She is." There was no more said. None needed. The child leaned against his leg, reassured by his stillness. The baby blinked once, then closed her eyes again. Night settled fully around them, not as something pressing in, but as something holding the house together. Each of them remained awake longer than necessary, listening to the same quiet, unsure but not alone. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the kettle warming, a child stirring, light finding its way through the curtains without urgency. He moved through the kitchen with the quiet precision of habit, setting out bowls and fruit, counting steps without thinking about it. The house had learned his rhythm, and he rarely had to correct it. She emerged later, the baby tucked against her shoulder, already awake but calm. Her hair was pulled back loosely, still damp at the ends. She paused at the doorway, taking in the room as if it had changed overnight. "There's coffee," he said, not looking up. "If you want." "Yes," she said. "Thank you." They did not discuss how long she would stay. The question existed, but neither of them reached for it. Instead, they shared the morning's work without instruction. She washed her mug when she was finished. He packed a lunch while his child ate cereal at the table, feet swinging, eyes flicking often toward the baby. The baby watched too from the safety of her mother's arms, her gaze unfocused but attentive in the way infants were absorbing tone more than detail. When his child stood and approached, the woman adjusted her hold slightly, not protective so much as considerate. "She can look," the woman said gently. His child crouched down, studying the baby's face as if it were something to be solved carefully. "She makes quiet noises," she said. "She's listening," the woman replied. "Like you." That earned a small smile. Days followed one another with little ceremony. He went to work. She stayed in the house, sometimes stepping out with the stroller when the weather allowed. She left notes on the counter, not explanations, just information. We walked to the corner. She slept for an hour. He read them without comment and threw them away once they'd done their work. In the evenings, they cooked together without planning to. One would begin, the other would join. They spoke mostly about practical things, appointments, grocery lists, the best way to get a baby to settle when nothing else worked. Their voices stayed low, shaped by the presence of listening children, even when they weren't in the room. He noticed how she folded laundry, aligning edges precisely, returning each item to a stack as if order itself were a kind of relief. She noticed how he knelt to speak to his child at eye level, never rushing her answers, never correcting her tone. They learned each other through repetition, through what stayed consistent. Some afternoons he returned to find the baby asleep in the living room, the woman seated nearby with a book open but unread. She would glance up when he entered, a look passing between them that acknowledged nothing more than the shared responsibility of quiet. "You're back early," she said once. Schedule shifted. She nodded, accepting that as enough. His child grew more comfortable around the baby, bringing toys to place near her, narrating the effort seriously. The woman watched without interfering, trusting him to step in if needed. When the baby cried, it was she who moved first. But sometimes, not always, she waited a beat longer than before, letting the sound settle, letting someone else respond. He did not comment on that either. One evening, the power flickered and went out without warning. The house fell into shadow, sudden and complete. His child froze, breath catching sharply. "I'm here," he said immediately. The woman stood as well, bouncing the baby gently. "It's all right," she added, voice calm, as if darkness were a familiar inconvenience. They found candles together, placing them carefully around the room. The baby watched the flame with interest. His child leaned against his side, reassured more by proximity than light. When the power returned, no one rushed to turn the lights back on. They stayed where they were, letting the moment finish on its own. Later that night, after both children were asleep, she stood in the hallway holding her bag. "I should go soon," she said, not meeting his eyes. He nodded. "Whenever you're ready." She lingered anyway, adjusting the strap, setting it down again. "Thank you," she said, "for letting us settle." He considered the phrasing. "You didn't disrupt anything," he said finally. "You fit." She looked at him then, something unreadable passing across her face. "That's kind of you." He didn't correct her. When she went to bed in the spare room, the door left slightly open. The house did not feel like it had been divided. It felt fuller, as if it were holding its breath, not in anticipation, but in recognition of something steady forming quietly in its center. Time softened around them. It did not hurry or announce itself. It simply passed, marked by small adjustments that stayed once they appeared. An extra toothbrush at the sink. A folded blanket left on the arm of the sofa because someone always needed it by evening. The refrigerator filled more quickly and emptied more slowly. She began to leave the stroller by the door instead of folding it away. He noticed, but did not comment. He moved it when it was in the way, then returned it to the same spot. It became a shared understanding, as unspoken as everything else. Some mornings, she joined him on the school walk. She stayed a half step behind, letting him lead, the baby pressed warm against her chest. His child spoke freely on those walks, narrating small observations. The shape of a cloud, a loose stone on the sidewalk, a classmate's new shoes. The woman listened with genuine attention, answering when invited, never interrupting. At the school gate, she waited back while he said goodbye. He watched from the corner of his eye as his child turned to wave at her too, a small, deliberate gesture. The woman lifted her hand in return, her smile brief but real. At home, she found ways to be useful without making herself indispensable. She cleaned, cooked, organized, but she did not rearrange. She asked before changing routines. When she took the baby for appointments, she left the times written clearly on the counter, as if the house itself deserved to know. He returned the courtesy. When she needed space, he gave it without comment. When she spoke, he listened without preparing a response. One afternoon, she sat at the table sorting papers, her movements slower than usual. The baby lay nearby, content. He recognized the posture immediately, the way shoulders curved inward when the weight of decision pressed too long. "Everything all right?" he asked. She looked up, surprised by the question. "Yes," she said. Then, after a moment, just forms. He nodded. He knew what it was to be shaped by paperwork, by small boxes that demanded clarity where life offered none. "If you need anything copied," he said, "the printer works. Thank you." That was the extent of it. Evenings grew easier. They developed a shared rhythm in the kitchen, passing utensils without looking, adjusting seasoning without debate. He noticed how she tasted everything twice, as if making sure it was worth serving. She noticed how he set aside a portion before adding spice, mindful of a child's palate. Sometimes, after the children were asleep, they sat at opposite ends of the sofa, reading. The silence between them was companionable, not loaded. When she reached for the blanket, he adjusted it without thinking. Their hands brushed once, briefly. Neither acknowledged it. The baby grew more alert, her expressions clearer. She responded to his voice now, eyes tracking him when he entered a room. He held her occasionally, at first awkwardly, then with more confidence. The woman watched without hovering, trusting him to find his own way. "She likes you," she said once. "She likes consistency," he replied. She smiled at that. "So do I." The house learned their combined sounds, the cadence of two adults moving carefully around sleeping children, the quiet hum of life being managed rather than chased. Nothing dramatic happened. No lines were crossed. No promises were made. And yet, when she left the house alone one afternoon to run an errand, he felt the absence immediately. Not as panic, as imbalance. He adjusted dinner time automatically, then paused, realizing why. When she returned, damp from a sudden rain, he took her coat without thinking and hung it with the others. She watched him do it, something like relief settling across her shoulders. Later, as she prepared the baby for sleep, he stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "You don't have to decide anything yet," he said quietly. She looked at him, then back at the child. "I know." It was enough. That night, as the house settled and the lights dimmed one by one, the sense of waiting shifted. It was no longer about how long she would stay. It was about what would happen if she didn't. The letter arrived folded too tightly, as if it had been handled more than necessary before reaching the table. She stood with it in her hand for a long moment, reading the same lines again without moving her eyes. The baby slept nearby, breath soft and even, unaware of the shift taking place in the room. She did not mention it at first. The days continued much as they had: school mornings, quiet afternoons, meals prepared without discussion. But something in her had changed. He noticed it in the way she checked the clock more often, in the way her movements grew precise again, careful in a way that felt like preparation rather than habit. That evening, she placed the folded letter beside her bag instead of inside it. "I'll need to go soon," she said, voice even. "Not tonight, but soon." He was rinsing dishes. He stopped, water still running, and looked at her. "Because you want to," he said. Not quite a question. "Because I should." He turned the tap off. The kitchen felt suddenly too quiet. "Is something wrong?" She shook her head. "No, nothing's wrong." She glanced toward the hallway, where his child's door was closed. "That's the problem." He understood then, or enough of it to let the rest be. Stability was not neutral. It created weight. It asked for things. She did not explain the letter. She did not have to. He had seen enough forms in his life to recognize the language of limits, the way institutions spoke gently while closing doors. That night his child came into the living room holding her blanket, eyes wide with the seriousness of being awake when she shouldn't be. "Is she leaving?" she asked quietly. He crouched in front of her, steadying his voice. "No one's leaving tonight." "But later?" He did not answer right away. He looked down the hall where the baby's small sounds drifted faintly from the spare room. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people have to figure things out." His child considered this. "I don't want them to go." He nodded. "I know." The woman stood in the doorway then, having heard more than she was meant to. She did not interrupt. She watched the exchange with an expression that held both gratitude and resolve. Later, when the children were asleep, she gathered her papers at the table, stacking them neatly. "I can't stay where I'm not allowed," she said, "and I can't ask you to rearrange your life." He leaned against the counter, hands folded loosely. "You didn't ask. That doesn't mean you wouldn't." He considered that. "My life's already arranged around a child," he said. "It always has been." She looked up at him then, really looked. That's exactly why. They stood there, the space between them filled with everything they weren't saying. He did not argue. He did not promise. He knew better than to offer certainty where none existed. The next morning she began to pack quietly. Not everything, just enough to signal intent. His child watched from the doorway, silent, absorbing the change. "Can I help?" she asked. The woman knelt to her level. "You already have." That afternoon, the baby cried more than usual. Not sharply, just enough to fray the edges of the day. The woman soothed her patiently, though her own attention drifted. He watched, aware of the fragile balance being tested. He made a decision then, not dramatic, not announced. He picked up the phone and began the slow process of inquiry, waiting on hold, asking careful questions, listening more than speaking. When he hung up, nothing was resolved, but something had shifted. That evening, he set an extra plate on the table without comment. She noticed. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I know," he replied. They ate in quiet. The children slept. The house held its breath again, not in fear this time, but in acknowledgement of the choice being shaped within it. Nothing was decided yet, but nothing was being avoided anymore. The answer did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, folded into the days the way everything else had been. A returned call, a form emailed instead of mailed, a conversation that ended not with certainty, but with possibility. He kept these things to himself, not out of secrecy, but because they were still too fragile to carry aloud. She continued packing in small stages. A drawer emptied, a bag filled and set aside. She did not rush, but she did not pause either. He watched without interfering, trusting her to move at her own pace. One evening, as she sorted clothes on the bed, he stood in the doorway. "I spoke to someone today," he said. She did not look up. "About?" "Housing," he replied. "Temporary arrangements. Family extensions." Her hand slowed, then stopped. She folded the last item carefully before turning to face him. "You didn't have to." "I know." She waited for more. When none came, she nodded. "Thank you for telling me." That was all. The children sensed the shift long before either adult named it. His child grew quieter, staying closer, her questions fewer but heavier. The baby responded by reaching for him now, arms lifting without hesitation when he entered a room. He accepted her weight without comment, settling her against his shoulder as if it had always been that way. One afternoon, the woman returned from an appointment later than expected. Rain darkened her coat again, though this time she didn't look cold. He took the coat from her, hung it beside his, then paused. "You don't have to leave," he said. She closed her eyes briefly, as if steadying herself. "I don't know how to stay without taking something from you." He considered that. "Staying isn't taking," he said. "It's choosing." She looked at him then, really looked. "And if it complicates things for your child?" He crouched and beckoned his child closer. "Come here," he said gently. She approached, wary but trusting. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "How do you feel about them being here?" She thought carefully, as she always did. "It feels normal," she said finally, "like when you don't notice the light until it's gone." The woman's breath caught. She knelt in front of the child, voice unsteady but sincere. "I would never want to make things harder for you." His child shook her head. "You make them quieter." No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to add. That night, the woman did not pack. She folded the clothes back into the drawer, aligning them with care. The bag stayed where it was, but it no longer felt urgent. Later, after the children were asleep, she stood at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. "I've lost a lot," she said softly. "Not all at once, just enough to know how fast it can happen." He stood beside her, close but not touching. "I know," he said. She turned slightly toward him. "I don't need promises." He met her gaze. "Neither do I." They stayed there for a while, the space between them steady and shared. When he reached for her hand, it was unhurried, his grip gentle. She did not pull away. She did not lean in either. She simply stayed. It was enough. In the days that followed, the decision became visible in small ways. A shelf cleared for her things, a schedule adjusted to accommodate new appointments. The house shifted without resistance, as if it had been waiting for permission. They did not speak of love. They spoke of logistics, of meals, of children who needed consistency more than certainty. And in that careful attention, something lasting took root. Not because it was named, but because it was chosen. Morning returned to the house the way it always had, quietly, without asking whether it was welcome. Light settled across the kitchen table. The kettle warmed. The child's footsteps moved down the hallway, unhurried. She was already awake. The baby balanced on her hip as she stood at the sink, rinsing a bottle. She had learned the sounds of the house now, the way the floorboard near the counter creaked, the hum the refrigerator made before settling. She did not startle when he entered. She only shifted the baby slightly and nodded. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." It was a small exchange, ordinary in every way, and that was how it stayed. The days no longer felt provisional. Appointments were written on the calendar without a question mark beside them. Shoes lined the entryway in pairs that matched. The stroller stayed by the door without apology. His child adjusted without ceremony. She no longer asked whether the woman would be there when she came home. She assumed it. She spoke to the baby as if to a sibling in progress, narrating her day, correcting herself when the baby blinked too slowly to follow. "She doesn't understand," the woman said once, smiling. "She will," his child replied. "Certain." Evening settled into a shared rhythm. Homework at the table. The baby on a blanket nearby, watching everything. Meals prepared together, eaten slowly. No one rushed away afterward. No one hovered. Sometimes, when the children were asleep, they sat on the porch and listened to the night. They did not fill the space with plans. They spoke about the weather, about work, about nothing that needed defending. When silence came, it stayed gently. One night, the baby woke crying, sharp and sudden. Before either adult could move, his child was already halfway down the hall, blanket trailing behind her. She stopped at the doorway, unsure. "I've got her," the woman said softly. His child nodded, reassured, and returned to bed without protest. He watched the woman soothe the baby, the practiced patience in her hands. He thought of all the ways stability announced itself, not in grand gestures, but in moments like this when no one questioned who would respond. Later, she leaned against him in the hallway, the baby asleep again. Not for balance, just because she could. The house carried them through the season without comment. Rain returned, then left. School days grew longer. The baby grew heavier in his arms, more certain in her gaze. Nothing about their life would look remarkable from the outside. There were no sudden transformations, no dramatic turns. Just a home that held what had arrived and did not let it slip away. One evening, as they locked the door and turned out the lights, his child paused and looked around the room. "It feels finished," she said. He smiled faintly. "Homes aren't finished." She considered that, then nodded. "It feels like it knows us." The woman reached for his hand then, naturally, without hesitation. He took it just as easily. They stood together for a moment, listening to the quiet they had built. Not perfectly, not without effort, but honestly. And that was what stayed.